Good evening, friends. I can see that we've got people joining us this evening from all over the globe, which is very exciting, and we are in for a real treat. So a very warm welcome to tonight's event, The Actor and the Academic, Shakespeare in 3D, which gives us an opportunity to hear from two absolute stars of the Shakespearean world. The brilliant actor, Sir Simon Russell Beale, and the wonderful academic, author and professor of Shakespeare Studies, Emma Smith, who is herself an alumna of Somerville, though currently resident at Hertford, though maybe one day we'll be able to lure her back. Tonight's conversation will be chaired by another amazing alumna of Somerville, Dr. Jackie Watson, who is Vice Principal and Head of Sixth Form at the pioneering comprehensive Oxford Spires, is heroically joining us at the end of a very busy day, for which she has our endless thanks. So I'm not going to take up any more of your time with introductions, as I know that everybody is really excited to hear from our special guests. However, I would just take a moment to welcome you to this second season of our Somerville at Home series of offline events. Online events, not offline events. We're actually starting this season early, before term even starts, because the alignment of the stars has allowed us to get these two stellar speakers together on the same call, so we simply couldn't miss this great occasion. I'll be back again at the end to tell you a little more about this Somerville's at Home programme and its aims. But until then, I hope that you all enjoy this incredible conversation. Jackie, it's over to you with our amazing thanks, our great thanks.
Thank you very much, Jan. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a conversation between two metaphorical giants in their respective fields. Professor Emma Smith, as Jan says, needs no introduction in Oxford and to those Somervillians listening. Though now Professor of Shakespeare Studies and English Fellow at Hertford College, she originally studied for her MA and her DPhil in English at Somerville. Emma has been a leading light in the opening up of early modern literature to a wider audience, and books such as her most recent, This Is Shakespeare, and 30 Great Myths About Shakespeare, written with Laurie Maguire, as well as her hugely successful podcast on the university website, helped to make the works of Shakespeare and contemporary dramatists accessible to a much wider audience. Her work in recent years on the printing of Shakespeare's works and his early audiences in Shakespeare's First Folio for OUP and the making of the First Folio for the Bodleian has met with widespread interest, and we're lucky this evening, as Jan suggested, to hear from one of the most respected Shakespearean scholars in the UK. We are also, of course, equally lucky to hear this evening too from one of the most respected Shakespearean actors working today. After studying English, of course, at Shakespeare, but we'll forgive him, at Cambridge, but we'll forgive him that. He has, of course, gone on to build a stellar career in theatres such as the RSC and the National, and on TV and on film. Knighted last year for his distinguished dramatic career, Simon Russell Beale's Shakespearean roles show his enormous range and include Macbeth, Leontes, Prospero and Ariel, Timon, Richard II, and Falstaff. Cameron Mackintosh, Professor of Contemporary Theatre here in Oxford in 2014, Simon's always been interested in the interface between theatre and academia. And that leads us on to the main subject of the discussion this evening. The overlap between academic work on the early modern stage, on early modern drama, and the performance of those plays on stage is a key focus tonight. In Emma's latest book, This Is Shakespeare, she identifies the concept of gappiness in a play, the radical uncertainties, as she puts it, of texts that allow different interpretations and allow the plays to have a consistent and changing relevance. In one of these gaps, she suggests actors do their work in a kind of three-dimensional literary criticism. Both Simon and Emma are interested in how this field of performance criticism has developed and in what actors and academics can learn from one another. So at this point, it's best perhaps to pass over to them so we can learn from them and explore more of these ideas further. So Emma and Simon.
Hello.
Hello.
It's really, really great to be here. Thanks for the introductions. I'm going to jump in, Simon. I'm going to ask the first question, though. I'm going to ask you, which is going to be about that phrase, literary criticism in 3 dimensions, which is your phrase about acting. Talk to us a bit about that.
Well, it was a phrase that I used in a profile for a newspaper. I can't remember which one. And it's one of those things that people mention quite a lot when they interview me. And funnily enough, Nick Heitner, the great director, in his book about his time at the National, mentions that phrase and says that he doesn't quite agree with me. But I'm still sticking to it, because I think with these great texts, I think that's sort of what you do, is that well, at least that's what I do. And I think it's part of the way I was trained, where I was trained at school and at university. And I think it's a question of making a series of logical steps about interpretation. And I know this sounds not making a mistake, that you build an argument that it can be supported at every stage. And so if anybody says, well, that doesn't make sense, you can support it. So rather like writing an essay, I suppose. So I stick by 3D criticism. The other thing is that in your latest book, The Gappiness, which Jackie mentions, as you say, that's where the actors do all our work. And Gappiness allows this great history of interpretative response to Shakespeare to flower over 400 years, you know. And I think that's the most fascinating thing I think about the space between us and you lot.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, whether that makes, I mean, 3-dimensional literary criticism sounds better than 2-dimensional literary criticism, in the way that 3D things always, like glasses, monsters and all that, they all sound better, don't they? And I can see that in some ways that notion fits with the whole idea that really plays exist on their feet, they exist in the theatre, and that it's that literary criticism is only a kind of parasitical kind of art. And I've thought quite a lot about that, really. What's the role of what's the role of finding out more about the plays, when really in normal times, and let's hope they come back, you could just go and see them.
We've only met once. The last time we met, we did a rehearsal for this, I said to you that when I started out, we didn't talk to academics at all. And it was the academics who made the first move, at least in my world, and said, look, come on, talk to us about what you do, and what you do is sort of a critical exercise. So yes, of course, actually, subliminally, you pointed out something brilliantly, which is, of course, I was subliminally saying 3D is better than 2D. But I think the whole relationship between actors and academics is now extremely productive. And I mean, I spend a lot of time when I do a play like Lear, for instance, in discussing things with academics rather than with practitioners. So I think the relationship is getting healthier and healthier, I think. Talking about Lear, can I just talk about Lear for a bit? Just an idea I had in my head. Because one of the things that I did, I was in the one of the London University libraries with a great academic called Sonia Masson. We were looking at editions of Lear. And the thing about Lear, as you know, is that they have very different endings, these two versions we have. So we were looking at that, and I was making a program about Folio, actually. And at the end of it, we were looking at the very last lines that one of the versions has, that Lear says when he says over the corpse of his dead daughter, he says, look there, look there. And Sonia said, of course, that is a great moment of transfiguration or apotheosis or something, where Lear suddenly sees something which is miraculous and beautiful. I went away that night and completely changed my reading of those two lines, simply because it's a challenge Sonia has set me, which is that you can really look there over the dead body of your daughter, in a completely opposite way. And I changed the performance because of the impulse of an academic opinion. Does that make sense? So it was an academic response, I suppose. But it changed the reading entirely.
And it changed.
Do you talk to more actors now?
Yeah, did it change to a kind of a triumph?
No.
I mean, there is that reading of Beale that says,
Yeah.
in the end, the suffering has transfigured him into something.
Yeah. It was exactly the opposite. I suddenly thought, I was sitting, and literally it was on the stage at the time, and I suddenly thought that he was saying to people around him, "Look at that. That's what life is. Life is staring at the body of your dead daughter. That's what life means. So look there, wasn't in any way transfiguring.
It's absolutely material.
Yeah. And that reading remained for quite a few performances, you know. And I think that's the joy of these plays. You can change it as long as you're surrounded by people who are willing to go with you. You can change it radically.
Do you think we've moved from wanting the tragedy, Shakespeare's tragedies, to give us sort of comfort or transcendence? Do you think are we in a place where that's what we used to say tragedies are really miserable, and somehow through that they transform us into something, into sublime, into sublimity. And now we seem to say tragedies are really miserable, and so are we.
Yeah,
that's why we like them.
I was lucky enough to start 30 years ago when I think we were in a very anti-heroic moment, so that you could do very very bleak readings of parts like Hamlet, of course. And I don't think I would have been cast as Hamlet 50 years ago, but I was cast 30 years ago, partly because of the way I look, and it's not a romantic look. And I think that was definitely the case 30 years ago. And I think also, that was the period when people were reading Henry on stage, were reading Henry V as not a heroic figure, were reading Coriolanus as a very damaged figure. I wonder whether, and these things go in circles, whether we might be coming back to, I wonder whether there's a group of younger actors who are going, hang on a minute, I would quite like to do a Henry V who was just gorgeous. And I'd like to do a Coriolanus who's heroic in some way. So I think these things have a cyclical.
Yeah. And I wonder if the cycle will, I wonder how the cycle will change by having been broken.
Yes.
Because I wonder if some of what we're saying about what we're missing from theatre isn't actually we all go to the theatre and it's actually, I mean, it's a very positive view of the theatrical experience. And I mean, it can be really positive to go to a theatre and see a sort of absolute, gut-wrenching, sad tragedy. I don't mean that it's all about happiness, but it does feel as if what we're saying that theatre will be like when it comes back is more sort of Busby Berkeley kind of choreography.
Yeah, I don't think that will happen. Well, I'm hoping it won't happen because I'm doing an Ibsen in November. I'm hoping to God that people will still want something miserable and bleak. But I don't think it's a simple equation, is it? I don't think because we've been through bleak times, we need to see something jolly. I mean, that's what they always say about the 20s, isn't it? In theatre, in a very sort of jolly place to be. But I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I haven't done any research on this, but I suspect there are quite a lot of serious plays around, and people, as you say, go to theatre for all sorts of reasons. One of which is to cry. And I think that still has a place.
Yeah, and to experience strong emotions collectively, I think is what, in a way, what those emotions are. It doesn't matter right now.
I think they're more subtle. The subtle change about the way we see the body. It could change, but that will have a longer time span in the way we change, the way we see, the way we see gender, which is very active now. We see race, we see sexuality and all that. That I think has a longer timing to it, a longer process about whether, rather than whether something's on the face of it happy or on the face of it sad.
You've turned into a sort of space invader, I think. That's what I was wondering. I'm just going to carry on. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You suddenly started to go very, very slowly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're adding Pac-Man to your many roles. Did you ever see his Pac-Man? He was brilliant in that.
Can you my back?
I did say a wide range, but I didn't realise it was quite such a wide range.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry. It's okay.
Can you still hear me?
We can hear you, so we can keep going. We can absolutely keep going.
Yeah. I want to know how academics see whether you think the same things happened on your side of the fence in terms of the act.
Yeah, I mean, so Shakespeare academia, I think it's really dominated very, very fruitfully, dominated by performance, by issues of
there's no section performance criticism, isn't there, which you see in...
Yeah, but I think all criticism is actually, draws on performance, draws much more on on theatrical performances, but on adaptations and I guess reception has become less interested now in why did Shakespeare write this or what did he mean, and we're much more interested, with Shakespeare and all kinds of writers, how have we made sense of it later, and what can the reception of this text tell us about it? And so I suppose that I think I did my undergraduate work at Somerville with Catherine Duncan-Jones, who was brilliantly interested in theatre, but actually didn't really teach with theatre. Took us to the theatre, which was the most amazing thing to do. But when we were studying in the late 80s, what we read were very much two-dimensional. The plays were two-dimensional, and I think that has changed really pretty drastically in the last 30 years. That's not how I think undergraduates would be taught now, or anybody in fact who's interested in the plays. So and I think in some ways, when I was saying perhaps literary criticism has got to earn its place as a way of understanding the plays, when the theatre has been so preeminently successful in explaining them to people. If that's what literary criticism is for, to amplify and show people different aspects of the work and why it might be valuable and why it might be interesting to them. I think theatre has been better at that in recent decades than criticism has, for all kinds of reasons about reach and and audience. So I think we've got I think you've got all the territory actually, if we were going to talk in those terms. The might start in ways, the way that everything goes in cycles. Academics might just now be starting to say, do you know what, perhaps these plays perhaps the theatre's not everything about these plays. Yeah. Perhaps it's important that people read them right from the early 1590s onwards. People have been reading Shakespeare as long as there's been Shakespeare. To think of the plays on the page as always sort of lesser or secondary, maybe itself needs a bit of the pendulum to swing a bit.
Well, I think there's a mirroring of that in our world, which is, and it's partly what your book picks up on, which is that, and this came very late in my career, an awareness that these texts are not fixed, and that you're very flatteringly right about the fact that theatre has certainly expanded its way of presenting stuff. But what's new to me, and what's new to a lot of my friends, is the idea that these things are these words that we hold in front of us are not necessarily the last word. And I think that's a fascinating area for actors to explore. When I mentioned that Lear thing, that Lear law is only one of the two versions that we have, isn't it? In the other version, he doesn't say that. So if we're giving Lear And of course, in a rehearsal situation, we're given usually a pre-prepared script by some mysterious person, which will be an amalgam of the various options. But we as actors tend not to have the time, but tend not to debate those options. And the idea of an edition being an editor's taste is fascinating, I think. And I think actors are becoming more aware, and Shakespeare, they're becoming more aware of the fact that they have more options and therefore more agency about what they wish to do. I mean, the first quarter of Hamlet, which Sam West did a couple of years ago, that hasn't been done for donkeys, has it? So just to see that on stage was fascinating. I think there's a whole thing that academics have given us, which is very valuable about the gappiness. Gappiness, which allows us to explore that.
And I think that idea that the text is not stable, that probably is contemporaneous with the idea of performance as being a sort of dominant way of seeing the plays. I think they came at about the same time, a sense of, and they were both about a sense of potential and a sense of possibility in the Shakespearean text, rather than an answer that had to be found and had to be worked out. And I think the move to the theatre has really helped us away from that sort of desperate quest to say, well, what does this mean? What was a hammer and a handsaw? And what another article about that.
I mean, I think there's two things about that. Firstly, basically, the 17th century sounds as if they just turned it all into musicals, as far as I can read. Every Shakespeare play was basically Boys from the Barricades or Kiss Me Kate. And I find that fascinating, is that there's a whole historical... The really weird thing about being a Shakespearean actor in this country is that you do get a sense, even subliminally, of being part of this sort of extraordinary history that goes back. And on the very first day that I started rehearsal on Hamlet, John Gielgud died, I remember. And I met him once. I didn't know him. I never saw his Hamlet, but that was one of the great 20th century Hamlets. And he died on the first day that I started mine. And there was a sort of arrogant feeling that that this was the next stage after Gielgud. So going back to finding out about what happens in the 17th century and what happens, in the rewritings and how late it's been for the theatre world to find, late 19th century, isn't it, before they started going to original text performance values, how late that is in the journey of Shakespeare, and therefore how much freedom that allows us, I think, is fascinating. Because you want to go, anything we do will be as nothing compared with what we're seeing in the 17th century theatres in London with The Tempest, for instance.
Absolutely.
And I find that very stimulating.
Yeah, and it's great to think that music, sort of live music, is such a big part of contemporary Shakespearean performance. I think it's something that lots of people really enjoy about the experience of seeing the plays, and that the musicality of those plays was so important. At the time. And
the other thing is about the way we speak it, which I also think is a fascinating. I said to you last time we met, or the first time we met, that one of the privileges now of going to a memorial service of a famous actor is that over the last few years we've now got to a stage where we can play their voices. So the last 3 or 4 memorial services or funerals I've been to of famous actors, we've been able to, as a tribute, play one of their great performances. And I remember this was only a decade ago when I listened to the great John Wood at his memorial service, and then Alan Howard, of course, huge Shakespearean actor, at his memorial service, and their style, and this is within my career, was profoundly different from anything I would dare to do. And you think, well, gosh, it's only 30 years, 30 years, and it's already changed, and that's to do with film, I think. and to do acting. So that's something we have to sort of feed in. There's another style coming in about what is convincing and realistic.
And so it's more. Do you think it's more naturalistic? Is that what film acting has given?
I think we fool ourselves about what's naturalistic, and I think none of it's natural. But our ears now need something that's slightly different about what we find convincingly effective. You know?
Yeah, it's interesting that verse speaking was such a shibboleth, wasn't it? Was that when you were training?
Yeah, it still is for me.
You do all that verse speaking, passing the pulse across the shared line, and all those great techniques Cicely Berry has in the actor and his text and all that stuff. Yeah, I'm sort of half Puritan, so I tend to mark up the script in terms of stress, but then I tend to learn it early. So I tend to learn it early with, in inverted commas, the correct stress, and then throw it around as much as I like, knowing that somehow, subliminally, in the back of my mind, that form is still there. But I am quite. I don't do sort of things like shared lines and I don't do ends, stopping at the end of the line. And I have also an absolute thing about that most people with any sense will only see a performance of mine once. So therefore, I've got to make it clear. That's the only and primary objective of any performance I do. Is that, so if you get that sort of really complicated verse, like Measure for Measure or Tempest, if you're going against the strict rules and making more sense at first hearing, fine. But I'm quite strict about that thing. I think it's partly, so I'm whittering here, and I think it's partly because if you obey the rules and then forget them, and the rules are very simple actually, then it gives you a sort of muscular solidity. So the line can't fall out of your mouth. It has to have some sort of energy, and if you obey the rules, even subliminally, then you'll get that security. Is Shakespeare hard to learn? And I'm asking that because one of the things that sometimes scholarship is interested in is the idea of Shakespeare as an actor, and that there is, and often I've heard actors feel a sort of special bond with Shakespearean language because it was somehow written with actors in mind, unlike, I don't know, the language of Marlowe maybe, or Johnson, which is clearly very different in lots of other ways, rather than just written by an actor or not.
You just reminded me of, I didn't know Catherine Duncan-Jones well, but I met her a few times. And she came and watched me film Falstaff, because we had a scene in which I think which college we were in, New College. Anyway, I said to her, "Would you like to come and just sit and watch?" It was great. She sat in the middle of the quad and watched this film, and we were talking. And she was the first person who ever said to me, "Of course, why do we always assume that Shakespeare was a mediocre actor? He could have been a very good actor. We don't know." And she had this thing. I think you would know better than me, but she had this feeling that he might have played Falstaff. That was one of her ideas. But he said, it's a complete. It's to do with astonishment about acting, isn't it? If you're a great genius writer, you can't possibly be a good actor. Actors aren't capable of that sort of thing. So, she was the first person to put the idea of him being a good actor.
I think the thing that Catherine probably most. Her biggest impact on me it has been in that ability to say, why do we think that? Why is this generally held belief? Why is that actually true? She's really excellent at that.
I've been reading her all day because I'm reading her edition of the Shakespeare narrative poems actually. And she's so elegant and so clean and clear. But actually asking those questions, saying, but if you do that, and I think it's the most difficult thing, and I'm sure you do it as an academic, obviously, is try and approach a part with no preconceptions. I think that's a really tough aim, but I think it's worth trying.
How does that fit with the sense that you're part of a long tradition?
I don't.
Perhaps it doesn't. I mean,
I don't know.
you don't need to be consistent about it.
I mean, I think, having said that, I was very aware that John Gielgud died on the first day of rehearsals, but after having thought how extraordinary, I did think, forget that. You have to forget John Gielgud before you even walk on. Did you get his shirt? Wasn't John Gielgud's shirt one of the great? Was it? No,
well, I don't know. Maybe I'm mistaking that. Somebody's shirt is very important in the history of Hamlet.
No, actually, that's a very interesting question, because I think probably you sort of acknowledge those great actors, then try to forget them. I do very few lectures, but I did one once, and I borrowed a phrase from a psychoanalyst friend of mine, and I can't remember the name of the psychoanalyst who coined it, but it was without memory or desire, and that's what I called the lecture. And he used to say that if you approach a psychotherapeutic session, I think I'm getting this right, you have to approach it without memory or desire. So in other words, you, I presume, have no judgment and no preconceptions. So I think that was such a good way of saying, why do we assume anything about any of these characters? And part of that is getting rid of even the most subliminal thoughts about what Hamlet is, because I mean, I might never have seen Olivier's film, but somewhere in my head it's there. Forget it. And I think very often you'll come up with sort of rather interesting, or personally interesting things that excite you, and they're probably not new, but they're new to you. But you've discovered it through a sort of, this is 3D criticism. You discover it through a sort of microscopic analysis of each stage of the character's development, and you take nothing for granted. I'm trying to think of.
What about characters you've played more than once? How does that work? Has that happened in your career?
I've never played. You're asking me, I want to ask you.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay.
I'm
more interested in what. You've done my bit,
I've never played the same character twice, but I've played the same play twice. And I was talking about one of them only last week, The Tempest, which I did. I played Ariel years ago, and then played Prosper. And my reading of the play was completely different. Not because of circumstances, because of the people I was playing with. My Ariel was very, very haughty and very unhappy, I think. Consequently, it was a sort of brittle reading of the play, because Prosper was also avuncular but reserved. The second time I did it, my Prosper was angry, desperately unhappy, and my Ariel, somebody called Mark Courtney played him, was beautiful and willing and wanted to help, and so the whole dynamic of the play shifted because of that, and that's because of the people involved as much as a rereading of the play.
I think we need perhaps to dip into some of the questions that the audience have been putting up there, if that's okay with both of you. This is absolutely fascinating. I'm really interested with this whole the insubstantiality of it all, and the kind of the way that things aren't fixed even within a run of a performance. I'm fascinated by what Simon's talking about there, but my fascination I need to put on one side for a second and have a look at some of the questions that people have been putting on the screen. one of the questions that I think is interesting, we've perhaps touched on just a little bit in some things that Simon said about productions he's been in, but people have asked about the role of the director, and what kind of, I mean, obviously, I am right, Emma, in obviously saying that this is a role that obviously wasn't around originally in the time of Shakespeare, but has developed in later theatre. But Simon, do you have anything to say about how your reaction to a text, your relationship with the text, fits in with the role of a director in a production?
Well, people often ask me what happens when I disagree with the director. And actually, I suppose like any sort of business situation, you try to do that as infrequently as possible. I can't think of many occasions when I've gone absolutely no. There have been a couple of occasions where I said I really don't want to do that. I can't do that. I'm afraid I fall in love with my directors. I mean, I'm absolutely subservient to their good judgment and their. I want to be loved and appreciated.
You're a spaniel. You're a spaniel.
I'm like Eleanor.
Like Eleanor or Hamlet. Yeah.
I'm a spaniel. And I think I remember a director once saying the most important thing, I can't remember if it was a he or she, to do in the rehearsal room is just to give the impression that they can't think of anything better than sitting there watching their actors. And I think that's sort of true. I think the best thing a director can do is just, and I've had the luck to have this many times, is just to be supremely interested in you. And it's rather a sad and probably dysfunctional relationship. And I appreciate their love. And in terms of how we debate things, I'm a big talker, as you can tell, so I spend a lot of time arguing my case. But if the director has the final say, I think. If the director says, I want this, then she or he will get it.
And that perhaps links on to another question that someone in the audience has posed about whether you could truthfully portray on stage an interpretation of a character that you didn't agree with, even if it was academically valid. I think we could debate academically valid for some time this evening, but nonetheless, it's maybe valid to the director in that sense.
It's slightly associated with that question. It's a very interesting question. And slightly associated with it is that I've on a couple of occasions done performances that I'm not happy with because I don't think either I thought them through clearly enough or I was miscast. I mean, I did the great director Adrian Noble cast as Edgar, and actually, funny enough, as I remember, it was sort of my request, because I think he originally thought of me as a fool in Lear, and that was Robert Stevens playing Lear, and he got me to do Edgar, and I remember I sort of knew what I wanted to achieve, or I knew what I was failing, and I was failing for all sorts of reasons, one of which was physical. Is that I never felt like a starving beggar on the heath. But that was something I probably could have done something about. But I didn't feel ever comfortable. And the other one was actually with Sam Mendes, who's my great and closest colleague. And I know he disagrees with this, but I thought the second half of Malvolio, I never quite there. And so there are. It was a feeling of uncomfortableness. I've never felt, oh my God, I'm doing something that I really disagree with, because I think you probably could, in most occasions, argue your way out of that. But I have been in situations where I thought, I don't know, I just don't quite fit this. And there were also the awful occasions, especially I remember with Malvolio thinking after I'd finished, oh, I've got this. I've got what I I know what I should have done, which happens a lot.
I think we perhaps ought to move on to a question for Emma, and then there's one that's got quite a number of votes in the line here about asking how fixed were those early texts and how early did people move from copying the idea of Shakespeare's own interpretation to exploring alternatives.
It's a really good question. And what we know about early readers of Shakespeare is they are reading right from the start with a sense of their own priorities, and they're making Shakespeare their own. They're seeing in a way what they want to see. They've got a kind of confirmation bias, like as we have. So they pick out the quotations. We can see them, making marks in early editions of Shakespeare's plays. Are all marked up and annotated, and have got so-called commonplacing marks, which were the marks that people put by the good bits, really. I'm not sure how early. I think for a long time in the 16th and 17th century, Shakespeare was a bag of lovely phrases rather than necessarily integrated, rather than being experienced as integrated wholes. So, a kind of standard A-level question now about how the subplot works, in relation to the central plot, or how this one scene exemplifies, the themes and all that, which are all about unity kind of criticism. Don't think early readers were interested in that at all. They were very disaggregating in their reading, because they were chopping up a play effectively and putting it under different headings and saying, here's a good bit about sunshine, here's a good bit about lying, here's a good bit about conscience, whatever. So I think they were always, I suppose that's a way of saying they were always finding in it what they wanted to, which I think has probably continued, and that's what we're all doing, is finding the bits that speak to us, or that we find we can.
Do you have any idea of what Shakespeare did in rehearsal as a person? We have no indication of.
No, I mean there's interesting stuff about how the plays are put together, and how much collective rehearsal they require, and how much sort of subsets can rehearse their own bits, separate from each other, and again whether the play is put together of pieces rather than as an ensemble might work now on rehearsal and being sort of focused on the whole thing. And all the stuff that's been the great work that's been done about cue scripts, which were the scripts that actors had. If you've got to copy out the whole of a Shakespeare play for someone to have a copy of it, so acting is all done from manuscript, not from printed texts, then you probably take as many shortcuts as you can. And one of the shortcuts was not to copy out all the other character speeches, but just the ones for that actor, plus the cue. And again, that suggests, plays are put together of quite distinct bits, and maybe certainly in rehearsal, the actor is not completely clear how his role fits in with everybody else on stage.
Do we have any idea that whether, it's actually going back to Jack's question about the question about directors, do we have any idea whether Burbage or whoever went, or Ken went, Bill, I don't like this line?
Yeah,
do you have any indication of how much they might have contributed? Because nowadays, of course, if you've got a modern writer, you usually debate about the text.
Yeah.
I
think one of the insights of that we've been talking about, one of the insights of modern theatre practitioners has made us look again at where there are discrepant scripts of Shakespeare's plays, where there are two early versions like King Lear that you've been talking about, and has made us feel much more inclined to attribute that to the processes of theatre and of theatre making, rather than, as we used to say, oh, this is bad printers or piracy, or this is something to do with how books get made. I think we now think this is something to do with how scripts are mobile in the theatre and are being changed all the time. Bits aren't topical, jokes aren't jokes anymore, all jokes are too topical and that we don't really want them, or there's all the kind of contingencies of, particularly of revivals. That's probably why we have why we've got different versions of the same play, like Merry Wives of Windsor or something.
The famous was it Elsie Knight? I can't remember who made that pastiche essay about how many children had made in a fair, kind of so famous beginning of the century, 20th century.
I think that's my
because I've always you what? It was the 19th, was it? I always just wondered, they must have I can't believe they didn't in Shakespeare's time say to Shakespeare, who is this babe? What is this baby that you suddenly introduced into this scene between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth? I just can't. But, I mean, perhaps they didn't, but I mean, I can't imagine two actors not going, hang on a minute.
Just a minute. Yeah. A baby. Okay, right. Yeah.
Where is it? Yeah. But perhaps they didn't. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I suppose that's a really interesting example that we've gone through thinking, oh, this doesn't matter. This isn't important. This is a kind of metaphor, or this is a way of amplifying Lady Macbeth's resolve or something. And I think it's actors who have said, you cannot really perform this speech without having some sense what you mean and where is this child. I think there's a great, I think you've got a book in this same series. Maybe have you written a book in the same series? Anyway, you're talked about in this same series. There's a book by Harriet Walter talking about being Lady Macbeth, and she says, you can't possibly do that.
Yeah, well, I think the series we're talking about, because I read about him.
Yes, that's right.
On one of the essays. And the interesting thing about that particular question is that the play seems to be saturated with children. So the idea that two brilliant actors like Burbage and whoever played Lady Macbeth weren't aware that somehow this play was about, who has visions of children, who kills children, who has a child that might be dead or not. I mean, there seems to be impossible not to play those two parts without some acknowledgement of that for the good of the whole story. Not just, it'd be fascinating to know. I mean, it'd be fascinating to know what, I mean, we know about Kent's improvisation and all that, but what they actually did contribute to the written story.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking as you're talking about it, I mean, having had a politics which was so conscious that the monarch had no child all through the Elizabethan period, it's hard to think everybody just kind of forgets that and thinks it doesn't really matter. That must have still been a kind of resonant. Is there someone to inherit or not, even though inheritance is a bit fraught. I mean, in the world of Macbeth, yeah.
I think we've probably just got one more chance for one more question, and I can't really ignore the slightly more light-hearted question which has received the most votes from a friendly Somervillian stage manager. I'm asked to ask you your favourite on-stage disaster story and how you and your colleagues overcame it. Pause.
They're never funny in the telling. As the stage manager who will know. God, I can't really remember. I mean, they're performances with my trousers split, and that was awful. That was in the Seagull, and honestly, the whole thing went on my bottom for showing, and I had to do the whole of the last act of the Seagull. Quite an emotional act. With my back up against the back wall. Richard Bryars once did a mistake in the last performance he ever did, the great Richard Bryars, absolutely wonderful man. But it was at the end of London Assurance, and the whole cast was on stage, as is the case in most of the plays. And he was playing an old husband, and he said, "I'm married for love, and you see how happy that made me." That was his line. And one night he said, "I'm married for love, and you see how funny that made me." And I don't know why we found that heartbreakingly funny, and we couldn't go on, partly because it was sort of a giveaway with Richard. But and then we for 2 nights we thought. I mean, we couldn't do it on the night, and then the second night we came onto that line, and the same thing happened. We all couldn't go on. But they're never funny in the telly. Well, they're never funny when I tell them.
Listen, Emma and Simon, thank you very, very much. I think at this point I'm supposed to pass on to Dan, who is going to reappear magically on the screen and bring things to a close.
We'll just have to keep talking.
She's going to work on reading an interpretation of a character, I think.
Yeah, she's gone. We'll just have to keep going.
Oh, come for lunch.
We could
Is that your family tree behind you? That's what we want to know.
Is that my family tree? No, with all the armorial bearings. No, my family are butchers from Romford. They didn't have.
Good enough for Thomas Cromwell.
You are?
Or, no, I was saying it's good enough for Thomas Cromwell.
Wolsey, was it Wolsey? No, Wolsey, wasn't it?
Wolsey, yeah, that's right. Cromwell's was a blacksmith, something, wasn't it?
Not quite so amusing a family tree.
You see, Jan's been pretending she's been listening. She's gone off.
She's gone to the pub.
Exactly.
It's a very busy life being an Oxford College principal, obviously.
It is, absolutely. Jan, for those watching, Jan is doing amazing work leading the university's planning for Michaelmas term. What will a socially distanced Michaelmas term? What does a socially distanced Freshers Week look like? If that gives you all something to recall from our own student days, it's a huge job. So. She says she's here, but we can't hear her.
I have every sympathy, as we've just been having a first week of term at secondary school.
Yeah.
It's been an interesting week last week. But, yeah, Jan says she's here, but you can't hear me in the comments. And there's a little flashing Somerville badge. Possibly. Okay, I think we are going to have to say goodbye and thank you without Jan, and I'll step in at this point in my really privileged position of having listened with great interest to the conversation this evening. Both of you, thank you very much. I think we've just demonstrated why the interaction between academia and acting on the stage is really so generative and so creative. So thank you very, very much for your time this evening. Thank you all very much for your questions and comments. And it's been a fantastic first part of the next series of Somerville at Home. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Great. Thank you.